A small tattoo on her wrist, just 3 simple numbers, would make Colonel Harrison freeze mid-sentence during the most important briefing of his career. But Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had no idea that morning, as she sat in the back row of the Veterans Transition Center, invisible to everyone who mattered, that those same numbers would expose a cover-up that reached the highest levels of military command and change everything she thought she knew about her own story. Maria shifted uncomfortably in the plastic chair, her DD-214 discharge papers crumpled in her sweaty palm. The Veterans Affairs Transition Seminar droned on around her, filled with buzzwords about civilian integration and transferable skills. But all she could think about was the rejection letter in her pocket, the 3rd one this month. Another company had decided that her military experience as a logistics coordinator wasn't relevant to their supply chain management position. Apparently, organizing the movement of millions of dollars worth of equipment across hostile territory didn't translate to tracking inventory in a climate-controlled warehouse. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow across the community center conference room. Folding tables were arranged in neat rows, occupied by veterans in various stages of their transition journey. Some wore ill-fitting business suits, clearly borrowed or purchased at thrift stores. Others, like Maria, stuck with clean jeans and button-down shirts, unable to afford professional attire on their disability payments. The air smelled of burnt coffee and industrial disinfectant, mixed with the lingering scent of anxiety that seemed to follow every veteran struggling to find their place in civilian life. Maria's counselor, Janet Morrison, had insisted she attend these sessions. "You need to network," Janet had said, her voice carrying the practiced optimism of someone who'd never worn a uniform. "Military experience is valuable in the private sector. You just need to learn how to sell yourself." But after 18 months of rejection letters, Maria was beginning to wonder if she had anything worth selling. The responses were always the same: overqualified, underexperienced, or the polite corporate version of "we're looking for someone who fits our culture better." She pulled her sleeve down to cover the small tattoo on her inner wrist. Most people never noticed it, just 3 numbers in simple black ink, 247. To anyone who bothered to ask, she said it was her lucky number. The truth was more complicated, buried in classified after-action reports and medical files that she'd been told were sealed permanently. Some memories were better left alone, according to the therapists at the VA hospital. Some stories didn't need to be told. The speaker at the front of the room was a retired Air Force major named David Chun, now working as a corporate recruiter for a defense contractor. His presentation focused on translating military achievements into civilian terminology. "Don't say you led a squad," he advised the audience. "Say you managed a team of 12 professionals in high-stress environments while maintaining a 99% success rate." Maria almost laughed at the sanitized language. Managing a team of 12 professionals didn't capture the reality of keeping her soldiers alive during mortar attacks while ensuring that critical supplies reached forward operating bases on schedule. Chun clicked to his next slide, which displayed a stock photo of smiling people in business attire, shaking hands around a conference table. "Employers want to see leadership, problem-solving, and adaptability," he continued. "You've all demonstrated these qualities in military service. The key is learning to communicate that value in terms civilian employers understand." Maria had heard variations of this speech at least 6 times in the past year. The message was always the same: change yourself to fit their expectations. Translate your experience into something they could comprehend. Minimize the parts of your service that made them uncomfortable. Beside her, a young veteran named Tommy Rodriguez was taking notes frantically, his pen scratching across a legal pad as he tried to capture every word. Fresh out of the Army, he still carried himself with the posture of someone who believed the system would work if he just followed the rules correctly. Maria remembered that optimism from her own early transition meetings. Before this string of interviews where potential employers smiled politely while their eyes glazed over during her explanations of convoy security and supply chain management in combat zones. Before she realized that her Bronze Star meant less to civilian hiring managers than an internship at the right company. During the break, Maria stepped outside for fresh air and found herself standing next to Sarah Williams, a Navy veteran who'd been attending these meetings almost as long as she had. Sarah worked part-time at a call center, a job that barely covered her rent, but was the only position she'd been able to secure, despite her background in communications and intelligence analysis. "Same old speech," Sarah said, lighting a cigarette, with hands that trembled slightly. The tremor was barely noticeable, but Maria recognized it. Post-traumatic stress had a way of manifesting in small details that only other veterans seemed to notice. "At least Chun means well," Maria replied, though she wasn't sure she believed it. The retired Air Force major had transitioned into the corporate world seamlessly, but his path had been smoothed by connections and timing that weren't available to everyone. Defense contractors were always looking for former officers with security clearances and Pentagon contacts. Enlisted personnel with combat experience, but no college degrees, faced different challenges in a job market that valued credentials over capability. Sarah exhaled smoke into the cool morning air. "You know what the real problem is? They want our skills but not our stories. They want the leadership and problem solving, but they don't want to hear about where we learned those skills or what it cost us." She was right, Maria realized. Every job interview felt like an exercise in creative editing, finding ways to describe her military experience without mentioning anything that might make civilian employers uncomfortable. No one wanted to hear about the time she'd reorganized an entire supply operation in 6 hours after a rocket attack destroyed their primary warehouse. They definitely didn't want to know about the decisions she'd made when standard procedures failed in soldiers. Lives depended on her ability to improvise solutions. Back inside, Chun was fielding questions from the audience. A former Marine named Jackson was asking about gaps in employment history, specifically how to explain the time he'd spent dealing with medical issues related to his service. Chun's answer was diplomatic, but essentially boiled down to finding ways to frame the gap positively, perhaps by mentioning volunteer work or continuing education. The subtext was clear: don't mention the PTSD, the depression, or the months spent figuring out how to function in a world that didn't include incoming mortar and the constant threat of improvised explosive devices. Maria thought about her own gaps, the periods when nightmares made it impossible to maintain regular sleep schedules, when crowds triggered panic attacks that left her gasping for air in grocery store parking lots. The VA had helped with therapy and medication, but explaining a 6-month gap in employment history without mentioning mental health challenges was like trying to describe combat without mentioning violence. Theoretically possible, but fundamentally dishonest. The session continued with breakout groups focused on resume writing and interview techniques. Maria found herself paired with 3 other veterans, including Tommy Rodriguez and an older Army veteran named Patricia Hawkins who'd served in military police. They were supposed to practice describing their military experience in civilian terms, but the conversation kept drifting toward frustration with the entire process. Patricia had been looking for work for over 2 years, applying for security positions that seemed like obvious fits for someone with her background, only to be told repeatedly that her experience wasn't quite what they were looking for. "I supervised a team of 40 MPs, Patricia said, her voice edged with exhaustion. "I managed security operations for a base with 12,000 personnel. But apparently, that doesn't qualify me to oversee security at a shopping mall because I don't have experience with their specific computer systems." Tommy listened with the wide-eyed expression of someone beginning to understand that his Transition might not be as straightforward as the recruitment posters had suggested. Maria felt a pang of sympathy for him, remembering her own naive confidence. During her first transition seminar, the afternoon session focused on networking strategies, with Chun emphasizing the importance of building professional relationships and leveraging connections in the civilian job market. Maria listened politely, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was receiving advice for a game where the rules kept changing. Every connection she'd tried to make, every informational interview and networking event had led to the same polite rejections. She was beginning to suspect that the problem wasn't her networking skills or her resume format. The problem was that her actual experience managing logistics in a war zone, making life or death decisions under extreme pressure, leading soldiers through situations that most civilians couldn't imagine, was either incomprehensible or threatening to potential employers. During the final Q&A session, a veteran in the front row asked about discrimination based on military service. Chun's answer was careful and legally appropriate, acknowledging that such discrimination was illegal while suggesting that veterans focus on positive approaches rather than dwelling on potential bias. But Maria had read the studies about veteran unemployment rates and the subtle ways that military experience could work against job applicants. Some employers worried about PTSD. Others were concerned about veterans being too rigid or authoritarian. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same qualities that made her effective in military service, decisiveness under pressure, attention to detail, unwillingness to accept substandard performance, were often viewed as liabilities in corporate environments that valued consensus building and diplomatic communication. As the seminar ended and veterans began filing out of the conference room, Maria overheard conversations that echoed her own frustrations. Someone was talking about taking a minimum wage job at a retail store because they needed income, despite having managed multi-million-dollar budgets in the military. Another veteran mentioned considering going back to school for a degree that would make their experience more palatable to civilian employers, even though they'd already demonstrated their capabilities in high-stakes situations that most business school graduates would never face. Maria gathered her papers and prepared to leave, her mind already turning to the job applications she needed to submit that evening. 3 more positions in supply chain management, all requiring experience, with specific software systems that she could learn in a matter of days, but didn't have on her resume. She would spend hours crafting cover letters that explained her qualifications, without mentioning the context in which she'd developed them, walking the fine line between honesty and the kind of strategic omission that seemed necessary for civilian employment. The parking lot was half empty by the time she reached her car. A 10-year-old Honda Civic that had seen better days, but still ran reliably. As she sat behind the wheel, Maria looked down at her wrist where the small tattoo was visible again, no longer hidden by her sleeve. 3 simple numbers that represented everything she couldn't say in job interviews, everything she had to edit out of her story to make it acceptable for civilian consumption. The numbers held the weight of decisions made in split seconds, of consequences that civilian employers would never understand, of a version of herself that she was apparently supposed to forget in order to move forward. She started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, joining the stream of afternoon traffic filled with people heading home from jobs that valued their experience and recognized their contributions. Tomorrow she would submit more applications, attend another networking event, and continue the exhausting process of trying to convince someone that her skills were worth more than the minimum wage positions that seemed to be her only options. But tonight, she would allow herself to remember why those 3 numbers on her wrist mattered, even if she could never say their significance out loud in a job interview. Maria had always been different from the other logistics coordinators, but none of her supervisors had bothered to notice. While her colleagues focused on following established procedures and meeting basic requirements, she spent her off-duty hours studying supply chain optimization theories, memorizing equipment specifications, and analyzing patterns in requisition data that others treated as routine paperwork. Her personal laptop contained detailed spreadsheets tracking everything from fuel consumption rates across different vehicle types to predictive models for equipment failure, based on operational tempo and environmental conditions. During her deployment to Forward Operating Base Anaconda in Iraq, Maria had quietly revolutionized their supply operations without anyone realizing what she'd accomplished. The base's previous logistics system relied on rigid scheduling and standard protocols that worked adequately in peacetime, but created dangerous inefficiencies in combat environments. Maria noticed that convoy routes were planned weeks in advance, without accounting for changing threat levels, that critical supplies often arrived late because requisitions followed bureaucratic channels designed for stateside operations, and that equipment maintenance schedules ignored the accelerated wear patterns caused by desert conditions and constant use. She began making small adjustments to her assigned duties, staying late to cross-reference intelligence reports with supply schedules, identifying patterns that allowed her to anticipate needs before they became critical shortages. When the motor pool started experiencing unusual transmission failures in their armored vehicles, Maria had already calculated the statistical probability based on maintenance records and environmental factors. She quietly arranged for replacement parts to be included in the next supply convoy. 3 days before the mechanics officially reported the problem, her innovations went far beyond simple logistics management. Maria understood that effective supply chain operations in combat zones required thinking like a chess player, anticipating multiple moves ahead and preparing for contingencies that standard operating procedures didn't address. She developed an informal network of contacts across different units, trading information about operational requirements and resource availability that allowed her to optimize distribution patterns across the entire region. Her methods were unconventional and technically outside her official authority, but they kept soldiers supplied and equipment operational. The real proof of her capabilities came during the summer of 2019, when a coordinated insurgent campaign targeted supply convoys throughout the province. 3 major bases lost their primary supply routes within a week, creating critical shortages of everything from ammunition to medical supplies. While senior officers scrambled to organize emergency airlift operations and route around the threat areas, Maria was already implementing an alternative distribution system she'd been developing for months. She had studied the regional road network extensively, identifying secondary routes that were too small for standard convoy operations, but suitable for smaller, less conspicuous vehicles. More importantly, she had mapped the social and economic networks that connected rural communities, understanding how goods and information moved through informal channels that bypassed military logistics entirely. Working with local contractors and tribal leaders, she established a distribution system that used civilian vehicles and traditional trade routes to move critical supplies around insurgent roadblocks. The operation required precise coordination and timing. Maria calculated fuel requirements, payload capacities, and travel times for dozens of vehicles operating across hundreds of miles of contested territory. She developed communication protocols that allowed her to track shipments and adjust routes in real time based on intelligence reports and changing conditions. Most challenging of all, she had to manage the complex relationships with local partners, who demanded respect for cultural norms and fair compensation for the risks they were taking. For 3 weeks, while official supply operations remained paralyzed by security concerns, Maria's improvised network kept critical supplies flowing to isolated outposts. Ammunition, medical supplies, food, and replacement parts moved through her system with greater efficiency and lower losses than the standard convoy operations had achieved under normal conditions. She accomplished this while maintaining complete operational security, ensuring that insurgent intelligence networks couldn't identify and target her alternative routes. The success of her unconventional approach caught the attention of Captain Lisa Thompson, an intelligence officer who had been monitoring the unusual patterns in supply distribution. Thompson realized that someone was operating outside normal channels with remarkable effectiveness, and she began investigating to understand how critical supplies were reaching bases that should have been cut off by the insurgent campaign. Her analysis eventually led her to Maria, who had been implementing these complex operations while officially responsible for routine inventory management. Captain Thompson's report praised Maria's strategic thinking and operational innovation, but it also highlighted how her methods violated numerous regulations and protocols. She had established relationships with local contractors without proper authorization, modified distribution schedules without supervisory approval, and operated communication networks that bypassed official channels. From a bureaucratic perspective, her actions represented serious violations of military procedure. Regardless of their effectiveness, Maria's immediate supervisor, Staff Sergeant Robert Kane, was furious when he learned about her unauthorized activities. Kane was a by-the-book logistics manager who measured success by compliance with regulations rather than operational effectiveness. He saw Maria's innovations as insubordination and her success as a personal embarrassment that highlighted his own failure to identify what was happening in his area of responsibility. Rather than recognizing her capabilities, he focused on the procedural violations and recommended disciplinary action. The disciplinary proceedings were complicated by the undeniable success of Maria's operations. Her improvised supply network had prevented critical shortages that could have resulted in casualties, and senior commanders were reluctant to punish someone whose initiative had solved a major operational problem. However, they were also concerned about the precedent of allowing enlisted personnel to operate outside established chains of command, regardless of their individual capabilities or the circumstances that prompted their actions. The compromise solution was to quietly transfer Maria to a different unit with a clean record, effectively ending her unauthorized supply operations while avoiding the negative publicity that would come from court-martialing someone whose innovations had helped protect American forces. Her new assignment was strictly supervised routine logistics duties with explicit instructions to follow all procedures precisely and seek approval for any deviations from standard protocols. The message was clear. Individual initiative was less important than institutional compliance. Maria's new supervisor, Sergeant First Class Michael Torres, was professional but distant. He had been briefed about her previous unauthorized activities and tasked with ensuring that she operated within proper channels. Torres wasn't necessarily opposed to innovation, but he understood that his own career depended on preventing any repetition of the procedural violations that had complicated her previous assignment. He monitored her work closely, requiring detailed reports for any activities that weren't explicitly covered by written procedures. The transition was professionally devastating for Maria. After months of operating with considerable autonomy and responsibility, she found herself relegated to routine tasks that utilized a fraction of her capabilities. She processed standard requisitions, managed inventory databases, and coordinated transportation schedules for routine supplies, all under close supervision that eliminated any opportunity for the kind of strategic thinking that had made her previous work effective. Her insights about supply chain optimization and operational efficiency were neither sought nor welcomed. More frustrating than the professional limitations was the realization that her innovations had been quietly forgotten. The alternative supply network she had developed was dismantled as soon as security conditions improved enough to resume standard convoy operations. No effort was made to study her methods or incorporate her insights into official procedures. The relationships she had built with local contractors and community leaders were abandoned, representing a loss of intelligence and operational capability that could have benefited future operations. Maria began keeping detailed notes about missed opportunities and inefficiencies she observed in standard logistics operations. Her training and experience allowed her to identify problems that her supervisors either didn't recognize or didn't consider important enough to address. Equipment failures that could have been prevented with better maintenance scheduling, supply shortages that resulted from rigid adherence to outdated requisition procedures, and transportation inefficiencies that wasted fuel and exposed personnel to unnecessary risks. The notes became a form of professional therapy, allowing her to document the gap between what was possible and what was actually happening. She calculated the financial costs of inefficient operations, estimated the operational impacts of supply delays, and developed theoretical solutions for problems that official procedures didn't adequately address. The exercise kept her analytical skills sharp while providing an outlet for the frustration of watching preventable problems unfold, because suggesting improvements had become professionally dangerous. During her final months of active duty, Maria focused on preparing for civilian transition while quietly accumulating evidence of her actual capabilities. She maintained copies of the reports that documented her successful supply operations, testimonials from officers who had benefited from her innovations, and detailed analyses of the problems she had solved through unconventional thinking. Documentation told a story very different from her official personnel file, which reflected the disciplinary concerns rather than the operational successes. Her discharge evaluation was professionally adequate but uninspiring. Sergeant First Class Torres noted her technical competence and compliance with procedures while avoiding any mention of her strategic capabilities or previous innovations. The evaluation satisfied administrative requirements while carefully omitting any details that might have made her more attractive to civilian employers or suggested that the military had failed to utilize her talents effectively. Maria understood that this was intentional, part of the institutional preference for avoiding questions about decisions that had already been made. The contrast between her actual capabilities and her official record created a fundamental problem. For civilian job applications, Maria possessed demonstrable expertise in complex logistics operations, strategic planning, and crisis management. But her military documentation emphasized routine compliance rather than innovative problem-solving. She couldn't reference her most significant professional achievements without explaining the circumstances that had led to disciplinary action, creating an impossible choice between honesty about her capabilities and presenting an acceptable narrative for civilian employers. As her discharge date approached, Maria realized that she would be entering civilian life with a carefully sanitized version of her military experience, one that eliminated the very accomplishments that best demonstrated her value as an employee. The irony was profound. Her most marketable skills had been developed through activities that her own service had ultimately discouraged, leaving her with an official record that failed to reflect her actual potential or the strategic thinking that had made her successful in challenging operational environments. The Henderson Veterans Center felt more like a prison than a place of healing. Maria walked through the sterile corridors each Tuesday morning, past walls painted in that particular shade of institutional beige that seemed designed to drain hope from anyone who looked at it too long. The fluorescent lights hummed with an electrical buzz that reminded her of the generators at forward operating bases, but without any of the purposeful energy that had made those sounds tolerable. Here, the buzzing just emphasized the emptiness, the sense that time moved differently in places where broken people came to be processed rather than truly helped. Dr. Raymond Kellerman ran the center with the efficiency of someone who had long ago stopped seeing veterans as individuals and started treating them as case files to be managed. His office walls were covered with certificates and commendations that spoke to his administrative competence, but Maria had never seen any evidence that he understood the actual challenges facing the people who came through his doors. During their monthly check-ins, he asked the same scripted questions about medication compliance and sleep patterns, while barely looking up from his computer screen where he typed notes that reduced complex human experiences to diagnostic codes and treatment protocols. "How are you adjusting to civilian life, Staff Sergeant Santos?" Kellerman would ask, using her former rank in a way that felt more condescending than respectful. His questions followed a predictable pattern designed to identify symptoms that could be treated with existing programs, rather than understanding the unique circumstances that had brought each veteran to his office. When Maria tried to explain the frustration of having her military experience dismissed by civilian employers, Kellerman would nod sympathetically before redirecting the conversation toward anger management resources and stress reduction techniques. The group therapy sessions were even worse than individual meetings. Kellerman facilitated discussions that felt more like interrogations, pushing veterans to share traumatic experiences that he then analyzed with textbook psychology that missed the essential context of military service. Maria watched fellow veterans struggle to explain experiences that couldn't be reduced to simple cause and effect relationships, only to have their stories filtered through diagnostic criteria that pathologized normal responses to abnormal situations. The message was clear. Their experiences were symptoms to be managed rather than valuable perspectives to be understood. Maria's assigned therapist, Dr. Patricia Newman, was well-meaning but fundamentally unprepared to understand the complexities of military transition. Newman had extensive training in trauma therapy, but no military experience, which created a gap between her clinical knowledge and the realities of veteran experiences. She encouraged Maria to process her deployment experiences through techniques that treated combat service as a form of victimization, rather than recognizing the competence and leadership that had defined her military career. "It's important to acknowledge that your military service exposed you to situations that no one should have to experience," Newman would say during their sessions, her voice carrying the careful compassion of someone who had learned to manage difficult conversations without truly engaging with their content. Maria found herself caught between honesty about her experiences and the growing realization that admitting to any problems would be interpreted through a framework that emphasized pathology rather than resilience. The center's approach to veteran employment was particularly frustrating. The job placement services focused on entry-level positions that ignored veterans' actual experience and capabilities, operating from the assumption that military skills didn't translate effectively to civilian work environments. Maria attended workshops where counselors advised veterans to downplay their military experience and emphasize their willingness to learn civilian job requirements, as if years of managing complex operations under extreme pressure were somehow irrelevant to corporate logistics positions. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Marcus Washington, the center's employment counselor, had never served in the military but considered himself an expert on veteran transition challenges. His advice consistently emphasized adapting to civilian expectations rather than finding employers who valued military experience. "Civilian employers want team players," he would tell job-seeking veterans, apparently unaware that military service involved more teamwork and collaborative problem-solving than most corporate environments would ever require. His recommendations focused on minimizing anything that might make employers uncomfortable, rather than highlighting the unique value that veterans could bring to civilian organizations. During one particularly frustrating job placement meeting, Marcus suggested that Maria consider applying for warehouse positions that would utilize her basic logistics background, without requiring the advanced strategic thinking that civilian employers might find intimidating. The recommendation revealed his complete misunderstanding of her actual capabilities and the condescending assumption that veterans needed simpler work environments than their civilian counterparts. Maria tried to explain her experience with complex supply chain optimization, but Marcus dismissed it as military jargon that wouldn't resonate with civilian hiring managers. The center's medication protocols were another source of ongoing frustration. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the staff psychiatrist, approached veteran mental health issues with a pharmaceutical focus that prioritized symptom suppression over addressing underlying causes. When Maria mentioned having trouble sleeping due to stress about her job search, Walsh immediately suggested sleep medications rather than exploring the rational concerns that were keeping her awake. The approach treated insomnia as a medical problem rather than recognizing it as a normal response to the uncertainty and financial pressure of unsuccessful civilian transition. Walsh's prescribing patterns followed predictable formulas that seemed designed more for administrative convenience than individualized treatment. Veterans with anxiety received anti-anxiety medications. Those with depression got antidepressants, and anyone mentioning sleep problems was offered sedatives. The medications often helped with immediate symptoms, but they also created a fog that made it harder for veterans to think clearly during job interviews or focus on the complex problem-solving required for successful civilian transition. Maria noticed that many veterans at the center were taking multiple medications that created their own side effects and complications. Frank Morrison, a former Army mechanic, was prescribed 4 different medications that left him drowsy and confused, making it nearly impossible for him to demonstrate the technical knowledge that should have made him attractive to civilian employers. Sandra Price, a former Air Force communications specialist, was taking medications for anxiety that made her appear sluggish and unresponsive during job interviews, reinforcing stereotypes about veterans being damaged or unreliable. The center's approach to veteran benefits was equally problematic. The staff treated disability ratings as the primary measure of veteran status, creating an environment where acknowledging problems was rewarded while demonstrating competence was overlooked. Veterans learned to emphasize their limitations rather than their capabilities, understanding that their monthly compensation depended on maintaining official recognition of their medical and psychological challenges. The system created perverse incentives that discouraged recovery and personal growth. Maria's own disability rating was based on a combination of physical injuries from her deployment and the psychological impact of the disciplinary actions that had ended her innovative supply operations. The evaluation process had focused on identifying problems rather than recognizing her resilience or the skills she had developed through overcoming challenges. Her rating provided essential financial support during her civilian transition, but it also created an official record that emphasized her limitations rather than her achievements. The disability evaluation had been conducted by Dr. Helen Morrison, a psychiatrist who specialized in veteran assessments but approached each case with predetermined expectations about combat trauma and adjustment disorders. Morrison's questions focused on symptoms and limitations, carefully documenting evidence that would support disability compensation, while showing little interest in the veteran's actual capabilities or potential for civilian success. The evaluation process felt more like building a legal case than conducting a medical assessment. During Maria's evaluation, Morrison had asked detailed questions about her experiences during the supply operations crisis, but only to identify potential sources of trauma rather than to understand the strategic thinking and leadership skills she had demonstrated. When Maria tried to explain how she had developed innovative solutions under pressure, Morrison redirected the conversation toward stress responses and coping mechanisms. The final report documented anxiety and adjustment difficulties while completely ignoring the competence and creativity that had made her military service successful. The center's social environment reinforced the message that veterans were fundamentally different from civilian society in ways that made integration difficult, if not impossible. Veterans were encouraged to socialize primarily with other veterans, attend veteran-specific events, and seek employment with veteran-friendly employers rather than competing in the broader job market. The approach created a separate and unequal system that treated veteran status as a form of disability that required special accommodation rather than recognizing it as valuable experience that could benefit any organization. Maria found herself caught between needing the services that the center provided and recognizing that those same services were actively undermining her efforts to transition successfully to civilian life. The financial support was essential for basic survival, but accepting it required participating in a system that pathologized her experiences and minimized her capabilities. The medical care addressed immediate health concerns, but the underlying approach treated her as a patient to be managed, rather than a professional with valuable skills and experience. The most insidious aspect of the center's approach was how it gradually convinced veterans that their military experience was more of a liability than an asset in civilian life. Through months of focusing on problems, limitations, and adjustment difficulties, veterans internalized the message that they were damaged goods who needed special help to function in normal society. The psychological impact was profound, undermining confidence and self-worth in ways that made civilian transition even more challenging than it needed to be. Maria began to understand that the center's apparent dedication to helping veterans was actually part of a larger system that benefited from keeping them dependent and marginalized. The staff's jobs depended on having a steady stream of veterans who needed ongoing services, creating institutional incentives to maintain problems rather than solve them. The focus on pathology and limitation served administrative and budgetary purposes that had little to do with actually helping veterans succeed in civilian life. As months passed, Maria watched other veterans become increasingly dependent on center services while making little progress toward meaningful civilian employment or personal independence. The system rewarded compliance and documentation of ongoing problems, while providing few incentives for improvement or self-sufficiency. Veterans who tried to assert their capabilities or question the center's approach were labeled as having attitude problems or unrealistic expectations, further reinforcing the institutional narrative that veterans were inherently difficult to work with. Realization that she was trapped in a system designed to manage rather than empower her was both liberating and terrifying. Maria understood that accepting the center's framework would mean abandoning any hope of utilizing her actual skills and experience in civilian life, but rejecting it meant giving up the financial and medical support that made basic survival possible. The choice seemed impossible: maintain her integrity and risk poverty, or accept diminished expectations and guarantee mediocrity. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, jarring Maria awake from the first decent sleep she'd had in weeks. Her phone buzzed insistently on the nightstand, displaying a number she didn't recognize, but with an area code that made her stomach clench with sudden anxiety. Military installations use that prefix, and early morning calls from unknown military numbers rarely brought good news. Maria Santos? The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and urgent in a way that immediately transported her back to deployment briefings and emergency notifications. This is Colonel Rebecca Harrison, commanding officer of the 82nd Logistics Support Battalion at Fort Bragg. I need you here immediately. Maria sat up in bed, her mind struggling to process why a colonel she'd never met would be calling her at dawn, 2 years after her discharge. Ma'am, I think there might be some mistake. I'm no longer active duty. I'm aware of your civilian status, Ms. Santos, Harrison interrupted, her tone carrying the kind of authority that made arguments impossible. This is about Operation Desert Shield. There's been a development, and you're the only person with the specific knowledge we need to address it. Can you be here by noon? Operation Desert Shield. Maria's blood turned cold at the mention of the code name she hadn't heard since her deployment. That operation was classified at levels that shouldn't exist in official conversations with discharged personnel. The fact that a colonel was mentioning it over an unsecured phone line meant something had gone catastrophically wrong, something urgent enough to override normal security protocols. "Colonel, I'm not sure I understand what kind of development would require Ms. Santos." Harrison's voice cut through her confusion with military precision. 3 American soldiers are missing in Syria. Their last known position was a supply depot that you helped establish in 2019. Insurgent group holding them has specific knowledge about our logistics operations that could only have come from someone with intimate familiarity with your unofficial supply networks. We need you here now. The words hit Maria like a physical blow. 3 soldiers missing. Her networks compromised. The innovative supply routes she'd developed to save lives during the convoy crisis had somehow become intelligence that was now being used against American forces. Everything she'd built, every relationship she'd carefully cultivated, every strategic decision that had kept soldiers alive, all of it had apparently been turned into a weapon. Maria's hands shook as she reached for the clothes she'd laid out for another day of job applications and rejection letters. "Colonel, I don't have clearance for that kind of information anymore. My access was revoked when I was discharged. I'm not sure how I could help with a current operation. Your clearance has been temporarily reactivated as of 06:00 this morning." Harrison replied, her voice carrying undertones that suggested this conversation was being recorded, and that Maria's response would have consequences beyond the immediate crisis. "Emergency authorization from the Pentagon. We've already arranged transportation from Charlotte. A car will pick you up in 30 minutes. The line went dead before Maria could ask any of the dozen questions flooding her mind. She stared at the silent phone, trying to process what had just happened. 3 years of struggling with civilian transition, of being told that her military experience wasn't relevant to modern employment, of being treated like damaged goods by VA counselors who couldn't understand her capabilities, and suddenly, the military needed her expertise badly, enough to reactivate her security clearance and summon her across the country. Maria dressed quickly in the closest thing she had to professional attire, clean khakis and a button-down shirt that she'd worn to her last unsuccessful job interview. As she grabbed her keys and wallet, she caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror. She looked like what she'd become, a struggling veteran trying to make it in civilian life, far removed from the confident logistics coordinator who had revolutionized supply operations in one of the most dangerous regions of Iraq. The car that arrived was a black sedan with government plates and a driver who introduced himself only as Agent Martinez. He was polite but clearly under orders not to discuss the nature of the emergency, responding to her questions with variations of, "I'm sure the colonel will brief you fully when you arrive." The 3-hour drive to Fort Bragg passed in tense silence, broken only by Maria's attempts to prepare mentally for a situation she couldn't fully understand. Fort Bragg looked exactly as she remembered from her brief visit during advanced logistics training. Imposing gates, efficient security checks, and the kind of controlled activity that marked a major military installation. But there was an underlying tension in the air that spoke to current operations and urgent missions. NPS at the gate were more alert than usual, and Maria noticed additional security measures that hadn't been in place during peacetime visits. Agent Martinez delivered her to a nondescript building that she recognized as an intelligence facility, the kind of place where classified briefings happened and sensitive operations were planned. The security check was thorough and professional, but also rapid in a way that suggested her arrival had been anticipated and prepared for. Within minutes, she was being escorted down corridors lined with maps and communications equipment toward a conference room where her immediate future would be determined. Colonel Harrison was younger than Maria had expected, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of bearing that suggested rapid promotion through demonstrated competence rather than political connections. Her uniform was immaculate, but showed signs of extended wear, indicating she'd been dealing with this crisis for longer than a single day. When she looked up from a stack of satellite photos and intelligence reports, her expression was grim, but focused. "Miss Santos, thank you for coming so quickly," Harrison said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. "I'm going to be direct with you because we don't have time for diplomacy. 3 days ago, Staff Sergeant Jennifer Kim, Specialist Marcus Thompson, and Private First Class David Lee were captured while conducting a routine supply delivery to a forward outpost in northeastern Syria. The insurgent group claiming responsibility has made specific demands that indicate they have detailed knowledge of our logistics operations in the region." Maria felt the familiar chill that came with learning about fellow soldiers in danger. "What kind of demands, ma'am?" Harrison opened a folder and pulled out a transcript that had been marked with multiple classification stamps. "They want us to shut down specific supply routes and abandon certain strategic positions. But here's the problem. The routes they're demanding we abandon are ones that officially don't exist. They're describing the alternative networks you developed during the 2019 convoy crisis, networks that were never formally documented or approved." By command, the implications hit Maria immediately. Her unofficial supply operations had been successful precisely because they operated outside normal military procedures, using local relationships and unconventional routes that enemy intelligence hadn't identified. If insurgent groups now had detailed knowledge of those networks, it meant someone with intimate familiarity had provided that information, either willingly or under duress. "Colonel, those networks were dismantled when I was transferred. The relationships with local contractors were terminated, and the alternative routes were abandoned in favor of standard convoy operations. There shouldn't be anyone with current knowledge of how those systems worked." Harrison's expression darkened. "That's what we thought too. But the intelligence these insurgents have is too specific and too current to be based on old information. They know about supply caches that were established after your departure, route modifications that were made by your successors, and operational patterns that should be known only to current personnel with high-level clearances." Maria studied the transcript, recognizing descriptions of locations and procedures that were variations on her original innovations. Someone had continued developing her unconventional supply methods, apparently without official authorization or proper security protocols. The network she'd built to save lives had been expanded and modified by people who didn't understand the careful relationships and security measures that had made them effective. "Ma'am, if someone has been operating unofficial supply networks without proper oversight, that's a massive security vulnerability. The local relationships I developed were based on personal trust and cultural understanding that took months to establish. If those relationships were exploited or mismanaged, it could have compromised not just the supply operations, but also intelligence networks throughout the region." Harrison nodded grimly. "Exactly. And now we have 3 soldiers whose lives depend on our ability to understand how these networks were compromised and what information the insurgents actually possess. You're the only person who understands the original systems well enough to help us figure out what went wrong and how to fix it." The weight of responsibility settled on Maria's shoulders like a familiar burden. 3 soldiers were in immediate danger because systems she had developed were being used against them. Her innovative thinking, which had once saved lives by operating outside normal procedures, had somehow become a threat to the same kind of soldiers she'd tried to protect. The irony was bitter. Her greatest professional achievement had become her most dangerous legacy. Colonel Harrison pulled out a detailed map of northeastern Syria marked with supply routes, operational bases, and areas of insurgent activity. "We need you to analyze current operations and identify potential vulnerabilities based on your understanding of how these informal networks actually function. More importantly, we need you to help us predict what the insurgents might do next and how we can protect our people without giving them what they want. Maria studied the map, immediately recognizing patterns that echoed her original supply innovations, but showed dangerous modifications that violated the security principles that had made her networks effective. Routes that should have been changed regularly had become predictable. Relationships with local contractors that should have been carefully managed had apparently been exploited for short-term efficiency. Strategic positions that should have been kept secret had become semi-permanent installations that enemy intelligence could easily identify and target. Colonel, whoever continued this work after my departure, didn't understand the fundamental principles that made it secure. They kept the efficiency improvements, but abandoned the security measures that prevented exactly this kind of compromise. These networks have been operating like regular military logistics, just with unconventional routes. That makes them vulnerable to the same intelligence gathering that targets our official operations. Harrison's jaw tightened. Can you tell us how to fix it? Maria looked at the intelligence reports, the satellite photos, and the map showing where 3 American soldiers were being held because someone had failed to properly secure the network she'd developed. The question wasn't whether she could help, she had the knowledge and experience necessary to understand the problem and develop solutions. The question was whether she was prepared to re-enter a system that had ultimately rejected her innovations and punished her for thinking beyond established procedures. Yes, ma'am, Maria said quietly. But if we're going to save those soldiers and prevent this from happening again, we're going to have to do things that violate standard operating procedures. We're going to have to think like insurgents instead of like bureaucrats. And that's going to make some people very uncomfortable. Colonel Harrison studied her for a long moment, then closed the intelligence folder and leaned back in her chair. Miss Santos, 3 soldiers are going to die if we follow standard operating procedures. Make me uncomfortable. Maria stared at the classified intelligence spread across Colonel Harrison's desk, her mind racing through possibilities that all seemed to lead toward the same impossible conclusion. The tactical situation was clear. 3 American soldiers held by insurgents who possessed detailed knowledge of unofficial supply networks. The strategic implications were staggering. Years of carefully cultivated relationships and innovative logistic solutions had been compromised, potentially exposing dozens of other operations across the region. But the personal cost of what Harrison was asking hit her even harder than the professional challenges. Colonel, what you're describing isn't just about fixing compromised supply networks, Maria said, choosing her words carefully. If I help design a rescue operation based on my knowledge of these systems, I'm essentially admitting that I violated military regulations during my previous deployment. The networks you're talking about were created outside official channels, using unauthorized relationships and procedures that my chain of command explicitly prohibited. Harrison's expression remained impassive, but Maria caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she understood the implications. Miss Santos, we're dealing with a classified operation involving kidnapped American soldiers. Your previous disciplinary issues are not relevant to the current crisis. Respectfully, ma'am, they are relevant if my assistance requires me to provide detailed information about activities that led to my discharge under less than ideal circumstances. Everything I know about these networks comes from operations that were officially deemed inappropriate and insubordinate. Helping you understand how they work means documenting my involvement in unauthorized activities that could be used against me later. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tensions. Maria realized she was essentially negotiating with the colonel about the terms under which she would help save American lives, but she also understood that blindly cooperating could expose her to legal and professional consequences that would extend far beyond the current crisis. Her civilian status provided some protection, but it also meant she had fewer rights and less institutional support than active duty personnel facing similar dilemmas. Colonel Harrison opened another folder. This one containing what appeared to be legal documents and authorization forms. The Pentagon has authorized me to offer you temporary consultant status with full legal immunity for any activities conducted during your previous deployment. Your assistance with this operation will be conducted under emergency provisions that supersede normal regulatory constraints. Maria studied the documents, trying to understand the full implications of what was being offered. Legal immunity sounded reassuring, but she'd learned to be skeptical of military promises that seemed too good to be true. Ma'am, what exactly does temporary consultant status mean? Am I being recalled to active duty, or am I working as a civilian contractor? And what happens to this immunity once the current crisis is resolved? You would be working as a civilian specialist with security clearance, appropriate to the mission requirements, Harrison explained. Your compensation would be at GS-14 level, equivalent to a field-grade officer for the duration of your involvement. The immunity provisions remain in effect indefinitely for any activities related to your previous deployment, provided your current assistance is conducted within the parameters we establish. The offer was more generous than anything Maria had encountered in 2 years of civilian job searching, but it came with complications that made her deeply uncomfortable. Accepting meant re-entering a system that had ultimately rejected her innovations and punished her for thinking beyond established procedures. It also meant acknowledging that her most valuable professional skills were precisely the ones that civilian employers had consistently dismissed as irrelevant or problematic. Colonel, I need to understand what kind of assistance you're actually requesting. Are you asking me to analyze intelligence and provide recommendations, or are you expecting me to participate directly in operational planning and execution? Because those are very different levels of involvement with very different risks. Harrison consulted her notes before responding. We need you to do 3 things. First, analyze the compromised networks to identify how the insurgents obtained their intelligence and what additional information they might possess. Second, develop strategies for neutralizing their advantages while protecting our ongoing operations. Third, help design and potentially execute a rescue mission that utilizes your understanding of regional logistics and local relationships. The third requirement was what Maria had been afraid of hearing. Participating in mission design was one thing, but actual execution meant returning to the kind of high-stakes decision-making that had defined her military career and ultimately led to her discharge. It meant taking responsibility for outcomes. That could include the deaths of American soldiers if her strategies failed or the political consequences if her methods violated current policies. Ma'am, you're asking me to help plan a rescue mission for soldiers who are in danger because someone misused networks I developed. But the reason those networks were effective was precisely because they operated outside normal military procedures. If I help design a rescue operation using the same principles, I'm essentially recommending that we violate current regulations to fix problems created by previous violations. Harrison leaned forward, her voice taking on the kind of urgency that suggested higher-level pressure. Ms. Santos, let me be clear about something. 3 soldiers are going to die unless we can mount an effective rescue operation within the next 72 hours. The insurgent group holding them has a track record of executing prisoners when their demands aren't met, and their demands are strategically impossible for us to accept. Standard rescue protocols have been evaluated and determined to have less than a 30% probability of success. The numbers hit Maria like cold water. Less than 30% probability meant that conventional approaches were essentially suicide missions that would likely result in additional casualties without saving the hostages. She understood why Harrison was willing to consider unconventional alternatives. But she also knew that the same innovative thinking that might save lives could destroy careers if the operation failed or if political winds shifted afterward. What kind of support would I have if I agree to participate? I'm not talking about logistical support or operational resources. I'm talking about political and legal backing, if things go wrong or if my methods are questioned later. Because everything you're describing suggests that this mission would require exactly the kind of thinking that got me in trouble before. Harrison's response revealed the depth of the crisis and the level of authorization behind her request. You would be operating under direct authority from the Joint Chiefs of Staff with oversight from the National Security Council. Any operational decisions you make would be considered authorized at the highest levels of government, provided they fall within the mission parameters we established together. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The scope of authorization was both reassuring and terrifying. It meant that her decisions would be protected by political authority at levels she'd never previously encountered, but it also meant that failure would have consequences extending far beyond her personal career. If the rescue mission failed, she wouldn't just be responsible for the deaths of 3 soldiers. She'd be accountable to the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. Maria looked around the conference room, noting the secure communications equipment and the maps displaying ongoing operations across multiple theaters. This wasn't just about rescuing 3 soldiers or fixing compromised supply networks. This was about validating unconventional approaches to military operations at a time when traditional methods were proving inadequate for emerging threats. Colonel, I need to ask you something directly, and I need an honest answer. Is this rescue mission actually about saving 3 soldiers, or is it about testing whether my unconventional methods can be scaled up for broader application? Because those are different objectives with different success criteria and different acceptable risks. Harrison's pause before responding told Maria more than her eventual words. The immediate objective is rescuing those 3 soldiers. But you're right that there are broader implications. The methods you developed during your deployment have been studied extensively by strategic planners who believe they represent a new approach to asymmetric warfare. If this operation succeeds, it could influence how we conduct military operations in contested environments. The admission confirmed Maria's suspicions and added another layer of complexity to her decision. She wasn't just being asked to help. With a rescue mission, she was being asked to demonstrate the viability of her innovative approaches under conditions that would determine their future application. Success could vindicate years of criticism and potentially transform military logistics doctrine. Failure could discredit unconventional thinking and reinforce preferences for traditional approaches. Ma'am, what happens to me after this operation is completed? Regardless of whether it succeeds or fails, I'll have demonstrated capabilities that civilian employers don't understand and participated in activities that I can't discuss in job interviews. How does helping you now affect my long-term prospects for civilian employment and normal life? Harrison consulted another folder before responding, and Maria noticed that this one contained what appeared to be personnel files and career development documents. The Pentagon has authorized me to offer you permanent employment as a strategic logistics consultant if this operation is successful. The position would be civilian, with security clearance and compensation equivalent to a senior military officer. Working on unconventional operations planning and doctrine development. The offer was extraordinary, representing the kind of recognition and utilization of her skills that Maria had never imagined possible. But it also meant permanently linking her future to military operations and classified activities that would always limit her options and define her identity. Accepting would mean abandoning any hope of normal civilian life in favor of a career built around the same unconventional thinking that had previously caused her so much trouble. Maria realized that Colonel Harrison had essentially offered her a choice between 3 futures: refuse to help and remain struggling with civilian transition while 3 soldiers died, help with the rescue mission and return to uncertain civilian prospects afterward, or accept permanent employment in a role that would utilize her capabilities but tie her to military operations indefinitely. The weight of the decision pressed down on her as she considered the implications of each choice. 3 soldiers' lives hung in the balance, but so did her own future and the broader question of whether innovative thinking had a place in military operations. Whatever she decided would determine not just the immediate outcome of the rescue mission, but the direction of her entire life. Colonel Harrison was watching her carefully, clearly understanding the magnitude of what she was asking. "Ms. Santos, I know this is an enormous decision with far-reaching consequences, but I need to know, are you willing to help us save those soldiers?" Maria looked down at her hands, noticing how the small tattoo on her wrist was visible in the conference rooms. Bright lights. 3 simple numbers that represented everything she'd accomplished, everything she'd sacrificed, and everything she was being asked to risk again. The decision would define who she was and who she wanted to become. Maria's voice was steady, despite the magnitude of what she was committing to. "Yes, ma'am. I'll help you save those soldiers." The words felt both inevitable and terrifying, like stepping off a cliff while trusting that her training would help her land safely. But even as she spoke, she could feel the familiar surge of purpose that had driven her most successful military operations, the clarity that came from having a mission that mattered more than personal consequences. Colonel Harrison nodded with what might have been relief, then immediately shifted into operational mode. "Excellent. We need to move quickly, so I'm going to bring in the rest of the planning team. Before they arrive, I need you to understand something about the political dynamics of this situation. There are people in the Pentagon who believe your methods are too risky and unconventional for official adoption. They've agreed to this operation because conventional approaches have failed, but they're watching for any indication that your involvement validates their concerns about unauthorized activities." The warning was clear. Success would vindicate her methods, but any failure or controversy would be used to argue against future unconventional operations. Maria was being given an opportunity to prove herself, but also being set up as a potential scapegoat if political winds shifted or if her approaches created problems that outweighed their benefits. "Understood, ma'am. Who else will be involved in the planning?" Harrison consulted her watch before responding. "Major David Chun from Special Operations Command, Captain Lisa Rodriguez from Intelligence, and Dr. Sarah Mitchell from the Defense Intelligence Agency. Chun has operational authority for the rescue mission itself. Rodriguez has been analyzing the intelligence on the kidnapped soldiers, and Mitchell specializes in insurgent networks and regional politics." The team composition told Maria several things about the operation's scope and complexity. Special operations involvement meant the rescue would involve high-risk tactical elements that went beyond standard military procedures. Intelligence representation suggested that the compromised networks had implications extending beyond the immediate crisis. The inclusion of a regional specialist indicated that success would require understanding local political and cultural factors that standard military approaches often overlooked. Within 10 minutes, the conference room had filled with personnel who carried themselves with the focused intensity of people dealing with a crisis where American lives hung in the balance. Major Chun was younger than Maria had expected, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of controlled energy that marked someone accustomed to planning and executing dangerous operations under extreme time pressure. Captain Rodriguez appeared, exhausted in a way that suggested she'd been working on this crisis since the soldiers were first read missing. Dr. Mitchell stood out as the only civilian in the room besides Maria, her professional attire and academic bearing contrasting sharply with the military uniforms around her. "Miss Santos," Colonel Harrison began, "these are the people who'll be working with you to develop and execute the rescue operation. Major Chun will be commanding the tactical elements, Captain Rodriguez will provide intelligence support, and Dr. Mitchell will advise on regional factors and political implications. I want everyone to understand that Ms. Santos has full authority to modify operational plans based on her understanding of the compromised networks and local conditions. The statement clearly established Maria's role in the hierarchy, but she noticed subtle reactions from the other team members that suggested not everyone was comfortable with a discharged enlisted soldier having significant input on a major operation. Major Chun's expression remained professionally neutral, but she caught a slight tightening around his eyes that indicated skepticism. Captain Rodriguez seemed more accepting, possibly because her intelligence work had given her a better understanding of how unconventional networks actually functioned. Dr. Mitchell was the first to speak. Ms. Santos, I've reviewed the available intelligence on the networks you developed during your deployment. Your approach to utilizing local relationships and informal trade routes was remarkably sophisticated. But I'm concerned about the cultural implications of reactivating those connections after they've been dormant for several years. The political landscape in the region has changed significantly since 2019. The observation revealed both Mitchell's expertise and her potential concerns about Maria's involvement. She understood the complexity of regional politics, but was questioning whether Maria's knowledge remained current enough to be reliable. It was a fair concern that Maria had been considering herself. Dr. Mitchell, you're absolutely right that the political situation has evolved, Maria responded. But the fundamental cultural and economic relationships that made those networks effective are based on factors that change much more slowly than political alignments. The key isn't reactivating old connections exactly as they were, it's understanding the underlying principles well enough to adapt them to current conditions. Major Chun leaned forward, his expression suggesting he was evaluating Maria's strategic thinking in real time. Ms. Santos, I've read the reports about your unauthorized supply operations, and I understand they were tactically successful. But rescue operations involve very different risk calculations than logistics management. We're talking about extracting personnel from hostile territory where any mistake could result in multiple casualties. How do your unconventional methods apply to that kind of tactical situation? The question was both professional and personal, testing whether Maria understood the difference between the supply operations that had made her reputation and the life-or-death decisions required for a rescue mission. She appreciated his directness and recognized that his skepticism was based on legitimate operational concerns rather than institutional bias. Major, you're right that rescue operations have different parameters than supply management. But the fundamental challenge is the same, operating in environments where convention approaches are predictable and therefore vulnerable to enemy countermeasures. The insurgents holding those soldiers know how we normally conduct rescue operations, which is why they chose this location and why they're confident in their defensive preparations. Maria moved to the map display, pointing to the area where the soldiers were being held. This location wasn't chosen randomly. It's positioned to force us into predictable approach routes that favor their defensive capabilities. They're counting on us following standard procedures that they can anticipate and counter. If we want to succeed, we need to do something they're not expecting, using methods they don't understand. Captain Rodriguez nodded, apparently seeing the logic in Maria's analysis. The intelligence supports that assessment. The insurgent group has been monitoring our rescue protocols for months, possibly years. They've positioned themselves to exploit our standard tactical approaches. Ms. Santos's point about unpredictability is strategically sound. Dr. Mitchell added her own perspective. The cultural aspect is equally important. This insurgent group has been successful because they understand how to exploit both our operational patterns and local political dynamics. They're using our predictability against us while presenting themselves as protectors of local interests against foreign military intervention. Maria studied the tactical situation, beginning to see patterns that reminded her of the supply challenges she'd faced during her deployment. The key is understanding that this isn't just a military problem. It's a logistics problem disguised as a tactical situation. They're holding our soldiers at a location that's difficult to approach directly, but they still need to maintain their own supply lines and communication networks. If we can identify and disrupt their logistics while creating alternative approaches to the target location, we can force them into reactive positions instead of allowing them to dictate the terms of engagement. Major Chun's expression showed growing interest as he followed her reasoning. You're suggesting we treat this as a logistics operation that happens to involve tactical elements, rather than a tactical operation that requires logistical support. Exactly. The insurgents are confident because they control the obvious tactical approaches, but they're vulnerable through logistics channels that they may not be protecting as carefully. If we can identify their supply requirements and communication dependencies, we can create leverage that doesn't require direct confrontation. Colonel Harrison had been listening to the discussion with obvious satisfaction, apparently pleased that the team was beginning to work together effectively. Ms. Santos, what do you need to develop specific recommendations for the operation? Maria considered the resources and information required for the kind of analysis she was proposing. I need detailed intelligence on insurgent movement patterns in the region over the past 6 months, information about local economic conditions and trade routes, and access to any available intelligence on the specific group holding our soldiers. I also need to understand what resources are available for the actual operation, what kind of assets Major Chien has access to, and what political constraints Dr. Mitchell thinks we need to consider. Dr. Mitchell responded first. The political constraints are significant but manageable. Local authorities are officially cooperative with American operations, but they're also concerned about any activities that could destabilize regional relationships. We have permission for a rescue operation, but it needs to be conducted in a way that doesn't create long-term political problems. Major Chun consulted his own notes before adding, I have access to a special operations team with regional experience, helicopter support, and intelligence assets. The team is small but highly trained, and they're familiar with unconventional approaches. The main constraint is that we have approximately 60 hours before the insurgents' deadline for executing the hostages. Captain Rodriguez provided the final piece of the puzzle. I can get you everything we have on insurgent activities and local conditions within the next few hours. The intelligence picture is comprehensive but complex. There are multiple groups operating in the region with overlapping territories and shifting alliances. Maria absorbed the information, already beginning to formulate approaches that combined her understanding of regional logistics with the tactical and political requirements of the rescue mission. The challenge was enormous, but it was also the kind of complex problem-solving that had defined her most successful military work. I'll need about 6 hours to analyze the intelligence and develop preliminary recommendations, she said. But I want everyone to understand that the methods I'm going to propose will probably violate standard operating procedures in significant ways. We're going to be operating in legal and regulatory gray areas that could create problems if the operation is scrutinized afterward. Colonel Harrison's response was immediate and decisive. Ms. Santos, those 3 soldiers are going to die if we follow standard operating procedures. Legal and regulatory concerns are secondary to bringing them home alive. The statement committed everyone in the room to approaches that prioritized operational success over bureaucratic compliance, but Maria understood that such commitments were easier to make during crises than to defend during subsequent investigations. She was being given authority to think and act unconventionally, but she was also accepting responsibility for consequences that could extend far beyond the immediate mission. As the team began to disperse to gather the resources and information she'd requested, Maria remained in the conference room, studying the maps and intelligence reports that would form the foundation of her analysis. For the first time in 2 years, she was being asked to utilize her most valuable skills in service of a mission that could save lives and validate everything she'd believed about unconventional approaches to military operations. The weight of responsibility was enormous, but it was accompanied by a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since her discharge. 3 soldiers needed her help, and she finally had the authority and resources to provide it. Whatever happened next would determine not just their fate, but the future of innovative thinking in military operations. Maria's rescue plan was elegant in its unconventional approach, utilizing principles that turned traditional military thinking on its head. Instead of attempting a direct assault on the insurgent stronghold where the 3 soldiers were being held, she proposed a coordinated disruption of the entire regional supply network that would force the insurgents to move their prisoners to a more vulnerable location. The plan required precise timing, deep understanding of local relationships, and the kind of strategic thinking that military doctrine rarely addressed directly. "This is insane," Major Chun said flatly, staring at the operational timeline Maria had presented to the team. "You're asking us to simultaneously coordinate with black market traders, disrupt legitimate supply chains, and manipulate tribal relationships across 3 provinces, all while maintaining operational security for a hostage rescue. The complexity alone makes this approach inherently unreliable." Maria had expected resistance from the Special Operations Commander, but she'd also prepared detailed justifications for each element of her plan. "Major, the complexity is precisely what makes it effective. The insurgents are expecting a direct, tactical approach because that's what we've always done before. They've positioned themselves to counter helicopter assaults, ground approaches, and even drone strikes. But they haven't prepared for someone to systematically dismantle their logistical foundation." Dr. Mitchell studied the cultural and political implications with obvious concern. "Ms. Santos, your plan requires us to interfere with legitimate business relationships and potentially destabilize economic networks that serve peaceful communities. The collateral damage could create long-term problems that outlast any tactical success." Dr. Mitchell, the disruptions would be temporary and targeted specifically at supply chains that support insurgent operations. The legitimate businesses would experience brief delays but no permanent damage. More importantly, success would demonstrate that we can protect American personnel without relying on approaches that typically result in civilian casualties and infrastructure damage. Captain Rodriguez had been analyzing the intelligence requirements for Maria's approach, and her concerns were more operational than philosophical. "The coordination requirements are staggering. You're asking us to monitor and manipulate dozens of separate supply chains simultaneously while tracking insurgent responses and adjusting our actions in real time. Even with advanced intelligence assets, the information processing requirements exceed our normal capabilities." Maria acknowledged the concern while pointing to solutions that leveraged her experience with complex logistics coordination. "Captain, the key is understanding that these supply chains aren't independent systems. They're interconnected networks where disrupting critical nodes creates predictable cascade effects. I've mapped the relationships based on the intelligence you provided, and there are 3 critical choke points that control access to everything the insurgents need for sustained operations." Colonel Harrison had been listening to the debate with growing impatience, clearly feeling pressure from higher command levels about the approaching deadline. "The fundamental question is whether this approach has a reasonable probability of success within our time constraints. Ms. Santos, what's your assessment of the likelihood that your plan will result in successfully rescuing those 3 soldiers?" Maria had run the calculations multiple times, considering various failure modes and contingency responses. "Based on the intelligence available and the assets Major Chun has described, I estimate a 70% probability of successful rescue with minimal casualties. That assumes we can execute the supply disruptions precisely and that the insurgents respond to pressure as predicted by their historical patterns." The probability estimate was significantly higher than the less than 30% chance Colonel Harrison had mentioned for conventional approaches, but it came with uncertainties that made everyone uncomfortable. Major Chun's tactical training emphasized approaches where variables could be controlled and outcomes predicted with greater confidence. Dr. Mitchell's political analysis focused on minimizing unintended consequences that could create long-term regional instability. Captain Rodriguez's intelligence background made her skeptical of operations that relied heavily on predicting enemy behavior under unprecedented circumstances. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. What if you're wrong about how they'll respond to supply pressure? Major Chun asked. What if they decide to execute the hostages immediately rather than attempting to relocate them? Your entire plan assumes they'll prioritize preserving their operational capabilities over making a symbolic statement. Maria had considered that possibility extensively, and it represented the greatest risk in her approach. Major, the intelligence profile of this insurgent group shows they've consistently prioritized long-term operational effectiveness over short-term symbolic victories. They've held previous hostages for extended periods when it served their strategic interests, and they've demonstrated willingness to negotiate when faced with genuine pressure. More importantly, executing the hostages immediately wouldn't solve their supply problems. It would just eliminate their primary leverage without addressing the systematic disruption of their operations. Dr. Mitchell raised another concern that addressed broader implications of the rescue approach. Even if the immediate operation succeeds, we need to consider what message this sends about American military capabilities and intentions. If we demonstrate the ability to manipulate regional supply networks and tribal relationships so precisely, it could increase suspicion about our other activities and potentially compromise future operations. The observation highlighted a fundamental tension in unconventional military operations. Methods that were effective in specific situations could create strategic problems if they revealed capabilities that adversaries could prepare to counter. Maria's approach would work precisely because it was unexpected, but success would educate enemy forces about American unconventional capabilities. Dr. Mitchell, that's a valid long-term concern, but it needs to be balanced against the immediate requirement to save 3 American lives. If we succeed, we'll need to be more careful about how and when we use similar approaches in the future. But if we fail because we were too concerned about revealing capabilities, those soldiers die and we learn nothing about whether unconventional methods can be effective in these situations. Colonel Harrison called for a brief recess to allow each team member to consult with their respective commands about the proposed operation. Maria remained in the conference room, reviewing intelligence reports and refining her operational timeline while trying to ignore the growing pressure she felt about the enormity of what she was proposing. When the team reconvened 30 minutes later, their expressions indicated that higher command levels were as divided about Maria's approach as the planning team itself. Major Chun spoke first, his tone suggesting he'd received guidance that wasn't entirely supportive of unconventional operations. Special Operations Command is willing to support your approach, but they want extensive contingency planning for situations where supply disruption doesn't produce the expected insurgent responses. They're particularly concerned about scenarios where the hostages are moved to locations that are even more difficult to access. Captain Rodriguez added her own command's perspective. Intelligence leadership is supportive, but wants real-time monitoring of all aspects of the operation. They're providing additional analytical resources to track insurgent communications and movement patterns, but they want the ability to recommend operational changes if the intelligence picture shifts significantly. Dr. Mitchell's guidance reflected broader policy concerns about regional stability and international relationships. State Department is nervous about the potential for diplomatic complications, but they're not blocking the operation. They want assurances that any disruptions to local relationships can be resolved quickly and that we're prepared to provide economic assistance if legitimate businesses suffer unexpected losses. Colonel Harrison synthesized the various concerns into operational parameters that would govern Maria's execution of the rescue plan. Ms. Santos, you have authorization to proceed with your approach, but with several constraints. First, you need to establish real-time communication, protocols that allow higher command levels to monitor the operation and intervene if necessary. Second, you need to develop detailed contingency plans for at least 3 different scenarios where insurgents don't respond as predicted. Third, you need to coordinate with State Department representatives about minimizing collateral damage to civilian economic networks. The constraints were reasonable from a command perspective, but they also added complexity that could interfere with the precise timing that made Maria's approach viable. Managing real-time oversight while executing complex logistics manipulations would require careful balance between operational effectiveness and bureaucratic compliance. Colonel, I understand the need for oversight and contingency planning, but I need to emphasize that the success of this approach depends on maintaining operational tempo and responding quickly to changing conditions. If the oversight requirements slow our response times or prevent us from making necessary adjustments, we could lose the advantages that make unconventional methods effective. Major Chun addressed the tactical implications of Maria's concern. What if we establish a hybrid command structure where you have tactical autonomy for supply network manipulations while I maintain authority for direct rescue operations? That would allow you to operate at the speed required for logistics coordination while ensuring that tactical elements remain under experienced special operations control. The suggestion offered a practical solution that addressed both operational requirements and command concerns about unconventional methods. Maria would have the authority necessary to execute her supply disruption strategy while Major Chun retained responsibility for the tactical elements he understood best. Dr. Mitchell supported the hybrid approach, while adding her own perspective on regional coordination. I can serve as liaison with local authorities and business networks to minimize political complications. If we're going to manipulate supply chains, it's important that legitimate businesses understand they're not being targeted and that any disruptions are temporary. Captain Rodriguez outlined intelligence support that would be essential for real-time monitoring and adjustment of the operation. I'll establish a dedicated intelligence cell that focuses exclusively on tracking insurgent responses to supply pressure. We'll monitor communications, movement patterns, and behavioral indicators that could signal whether they're responding as predicted or developing alternative strategies. Colonel Harrison reviewed the proposed command structure and coordination mechanisms before giving final authorization for the operation. Ms. Santos, you have tactical authority for supply network operations with support from the rest of the team for their respective areas of expertise. The operation timeline begins in 6 hours with the first supply disruption scheduled for dawn local time. You have 48 hours to create sufficient pressure to force insurgent movement, at which point Major Chun's tactical team will execute the rescue. The timeline was tight but workable, assuming that Maria's predictions about insurgent behavior proved accurate and that the complex coordination requirements could be managed without critical delays. She felt the familiar combination of excitement and anxiety that came with beginning operations, where success depended on factors that couldn't be completely controlled. Understood, Colonel. I'll begin implementing the supply disruptions according to the schedule we've established. But I want everyone to understand that once we start this process, we're committed to following through regardless of how insurgents initially respond. If we hesitate or reverse course because their first reactions seem unexpected, we lose all advantage and likely guarantee failure. The statement committed the entire team to trusting Maria's judgment during the critical phases of the operation. Even if insurgent responses created temporary uncertainty about whether the plan was working, it was the kind of trust that had been absent during her previous military service, when innovative approaches were usually abandoned at the first sign of unexpected complications. As the team dispersed to begin final preparations, Maria remained focused on the operational details that would determine whether 3 American soldiers lived or died, based on her understanding of supply networks and insurgent behavior. The next 48 hours would validate or discredit everything she believed about unconventional approaches to military operations. The first signs that Maria's plan was working came at 0347 hours, exactly 18 minutes after the initial supply disruptions began. Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled through the secure communication system with barely contained excitement. "We're intercepting increased radio chatter from the target location. The insurgents are trying to contact their supply coordinators, and they're not getting the responses they expect." Maria studied the real-time intelligence feeds from her position in the operations center, watching as digital indicators tracked the cascade effects of her carefully orchestrated supply chain manipulations. 3 critical fuel depots had simultaneously experienced equipment failures that would delay deliveries for at least 12 hours. 2 major food suppliers had discovered inventory discrepancies that required immediate auditing. Most importantly, the tribal leader who controlled access to the mountain passes the insurgents used for secure communications had suddenly decided that his traditional routes needed spiritual cleansing that would close them for the next 2 days. "Phase 1 is executing exactly as predicted," Maria reported to Colonel Harrison. "The insurgents are experiencing supply pressure, but they don't yet understand that it's coordinated or systematic. They're still attributing the problems to normal operational friction rather than deliberate interference." Dr. Mitchell monitored the political and cultural responses from her liaison position with local authorities. The tribal leaders are cooperating better than expected. They understand that disrupting insurgent supply lines ultimately benefits regional stability, and they appreciate that we're working through traditional relationships rather than imposing solutions by force. The success of the cultural coordination was critical to Maria's overall strategy. By working with local power structures rather than bypassing them, the operation was reinforcing existing relationships while creating pressure on insurgent networks. The approach took longer than direct military action, but it also created less collateral damage and fewer long-term complications. Major Chun monitored the tactical situation from his forward position, where his special operations team waited for the insurgents to move their prisoners to a more vulnerable location. Thermal imaging shows increased activity around the target building. Personnel moving in and out more frequently than baseline patterns. Could be preparation for relocation, or could be response to supply pressure causing internal discussions. The uncertainty was exactly what Maria had expected during the early phases of the operation. Insurgent groups didn't immediately abandon secure positions when facing supply problems, but they did begin considering alternatives and preparing contingency plans. The key was maintaining pressure long enough for practical necessities to overcome strategic preferences. At 0623 hours, the operation entered Phase 2 as pre-positioned assets created a second wave of supply disruptions, targeting different categories of resources. The insurgents' medical supplies were delayed by customs inspections that local authorities had suddenly decided to conduct with unusual thoroughness. Their ammunition resupply convoy encountered road maintenance that blocked the primary route while alternative paths experienced unexpected rock slides. Their communications equipment supplier discovered that essential replacement parts had been mislabeled during shipping and were currently lost somewhere in the regional transportation network. Radio intercepts show increasing frustration and confusion, Captain Rodriguez reported. They're trying to activate backup supply sources, but those are experiencing similar problems. The pattern is still subtle enough that they're not certain. It's coordinated, but they're definitely feeling pressure. Maria tracked the psychological progression that she'd predicted based on historical analysis of similar insurgent groups. Initial supply problems were treated as operational nuisances. That could be solved through standard procedures. As problems multiplied and backup systems also failed, the focus would shift from solving individual issues to identifying systematic causes. Eventually, practical necessities would force strategic reconsiderations, regardless of leadership preferences. They're going to reach the decision point within the next 6 hours, Maria announced to the operations team. Either they'll conclude that their current position is becoming untenable and begin planning relocation, or they'll decide that the supply problems are temporary and can be endured without changing their strategic positioning. Dr. Mitchell had been monitoring communications between various tribal and business leaders throughout the region, tracking the broader effects of the supply disruptions. The collateral impact is minimal and temporary as predicted. Local businesses understand that the delays are related to security operations, and they're receiving compensation for any losses. More importantly, community leaders are seeing this as an example of how Americans can work within local systems rather than imposing external solutions. The positive cultural reception was validating Maria's belief that unconventional military approaches could be more effective than traditional methods while also creating fewer long-term problems. By working with existing relationships and power structures, the operation was achieving military objectives while reinforcing rather than undermining regional stability. At 0847 hours, the breakthrough came in exactly the form Maria had predicted. Thermal imaging detected systematic movement around the insurgent stronghold that indicated preparation for major relocation rather than routine operational activity. Personnel were consolidating equipment, organizing supplies, and establishing movement patterns consistent with abandoning their current position. Target is preparing for movement, Major Chun reported, his voice carrying the focused intensity of someone whose operational phase was about to begin. Thermal signature shows they're organizing for convoy movement, probably planning to relocate during daylight hours when they have better visibility for defensive purposes. Maria consulted her analysis of insurgent movement patterns and regional geography to predict their most likely destination. Based on their historical preferences and current supply constraints, they'll probably move to the secondary stronghold, approximately 40 kilometers northeast. It's more defensible against direct assault, but it's also more isolated and dependent on the same supply networks we've been disrupting. Captain Rodriguez confirmed the prediction with intelligence analysis. Communications intercept support that assessment. They're coordinating with assets near the secondary location, and they're requesting supplies to be delivered there rather than to their current position. The insurgent response was exactly what Maria had hoped for. They were trading tactical advantages for strategic vulnerabilities. The secondary stronghold was indeed more defensible against conventional assault, but it was also more dependent on external supply lines and more vulnerable to the kind of systematic pressure that had forced them to relocate in the first place. Major Chun began positioning his tactical team for intercept operations along the predicted movement route. If we can engage them during movement, we have maximum tactical advantage. They'll be exposed, focused on transportation security, and operating in terrain that favors our capabilities over theirs. Negative, Maria intervened, her strategic analysis suggesting a different approach. If we intercept during movement, we confirm that the supply disruptions were coordinated American operations. That eliminates our advantage for future operations and teaches them to prepare for similar tactics. Better to let them complete relocation and then use the same supply pressure to force them into an even more vulnerable position. The recommendation surprised everyone, including Maria herself. Her instinctive response was to advise immediate action to rescue the soldiers as quickly as possible, but her strategic analysis suggested that patience would produce better outcomes. With lower risk, Colonel Harrison faced the difficult decision of choosing between immediate rescue attempts and continued strategic pressure. Ms. Santos, those soldiers have been in enemy hands for almost 4 days. Every hour we delay increases the risk of execution or increased security measures that could make rescue more difficult. Colonel, I understand the urgency, but the intelligence shows that this insurgent group has never executed hostages during strategic relocations. They use prisoners as leverage for negotiation and protection during movement. If we can force them to relocate again from their secondary position, they'll be operating from a location that's both tactically vulnerable and strategically unsustainable. Dr. Mitchell supported Maria's analysis from a regional perspective. The secondary stronghold is in territory where local support for insurgent operations is minimal. If they're forced to relocate there, they'll be more dependent on external resources and less able to rely on community protection. Major Chun's tactical assessment was more skeptical. The longer we wait, the more time they have to adapt to our pressure and develop countermeasures. If they realize that their supply problems are coordinated American operations, they could change their entire approach to holding the prisoners. The debate reflected fundamental differences in approach between conventional military thinking and the unconventional methods that Maria was advocating. Conventional wisdom emphasized speed and direct action to minimize variables and maintain tactical initiative. Maria's approach emphasized strategic patience and systematic pressure to create advantages that didn't depend on tactical superiority. Captain Rodriguez provided intelligence analysis that helped resolve the debate. Communications intercepts suggest they're not yet attributing supply problems to coordinated American operations. They're still treating individual disruptions as separate issues rather than recognizing systematic interference. If we maintain operational security, we can probably continue pressure operations without revealing our involvement. Colonel Harrison made the decision that would determine the operation's ultimate approach. Ms. Santos, you have authorization to continue supply pressure operations through the insurgent relocation. Major Chun, position your team for potential intercept, but do not engage unless Ms. Santos determines that strategic pressure has failed and immediate tactical action is necessary. The decision represented extraordinary trust in Maria's judgment and methods, but it also increased her responsibility for outcomes that could include the deaths of American soldiers if her strategic analysis proved incorrect. She was being given the authority to prioritize long-term strategic advantages over immediate tactical opportunities, a level of operational discretion that few military personnel ever received. At 11:34 hours, thermal imaging confirmed that the insurgent convoy had departed their original stronghold with the 3 American prisoners. The movement proceeded exactly as Maria had predicted, following routes that avoided areas where her supply disruptions had created security concerns, while moving toward the secondary location that offered better defensive positioning but increased logistical vulnerabilities. Convoy movement confirmed, Major Chun reported. 3 vehicles, probably 8 to 12 personnel total, moving at cautious speed along secondary roads. Prisoners appear to be in the second vehicle, based on movement patterns and vehicle loading. Maria tracked the convoy's progress while simultaneously implementing Phase 3 of her supply disruption strategy. The secondary stronghold would face even more systematic pressure than the original location, with critical supply routes already compromised and local support networks neutralized through diplomatic and economic incentives. Phase 3 implementation beginning now, Maria announced. By the time they reach their destination, they'll discover that their new location has the same supply problems that forced them to relocate from their original position. The next 12 hours would determine whether Maria's unconventional approach could successfully rescue 3 American soldiers while demonstrating the viability of strategic pressure over tactical force. Everything she believed about military innovation was being tested under conditions where failure would cost lives and validate critics who believed unconventional methods were too risky for operational use. The insurgent convoy had been at their secondary stronghold for exactly 14 hours when Maria's systematic pressure began producing the cascade effect she'd calculated would force their final fatal mistake. Captain Rodriguez's intelligence intercepts painted a picture of growing desperation and confusion among the insurgent leadership as they discovered that their supposedly secure fallback position offered no relief from the supply problems that had driven them from their original location. They're reporting to higher command that local suppliers are unable to deliver critical resources, Rodriguez announced, her voice carrying satisfaction at seeing Maria's predictions validated. Fuel deliveries are delayed indefinitely due to equipment failures at 3 separate depots. Food supplies are caught in customs inspections that tribal authorities claim could take weeks to resolve. Most critically, their communications equipment. Supplier has discovered that essential replacement parts were damaged during shipping and replacements won't be available for at least 10 days. Maria monitored the real-time intelligence feeds while tracking the precise timing of each supply disruption. The beauty of her approach was that each individual problem appeared to be the result of normal operational friction rather than coordinated interference. Local authorities were conducting legitimate customs inspections. Equipment failures were documented with proper maintenance records, and shipping delays were supported by authentic documentation from transportation companies. The insurgents were experiencing systematic pressure, but they couldn't identify a clear target for retaliation. They're beginning to understand that this isn't coincidence, Dr. Mitchell reported from her liaison position with tribal leaders. Intercepted communications show increasing references to systematic interference and coordinated pressure, but they're still not certain whether it's American operations or rival insurgent groups trying to weaken their position. The ambiguity was crucial to Maria's strategy. As long as the insurgents remained uncertain about the source of their problems, they would focus on solving immediate supply issues rather than developing countermeasures against American operations. Their confusion was buying time for the pressure to reach critical levels that would force decisive action. Major Chun's tactical team remained positioned for rapid response, monitoring insurgent movement patterns and preparing for multiple contingency scenarios. Thermal imaging shows increased activity around their perimeter defenses. They're reinforcing positions and establishing additional observation posts. Definitely acting like they expect some kind of attack, but they're preparing for conventional assault rather than continued supply pressure. The insurgent defensive preparations revealed the fundamental difference between conventional military thinking and Maria's unconventional approach. Their leadership understood how to defend against direct attack, but they were struggling to counter systematic pressure that attacked their operational foundation rather than their tactical positions. They were preparing for the wrong kind of threat because they couldn't conceive of warfare conducted through supply chain manipulation. At 1647 hours, the critical breakthrough came in precisely the form Maria had predicted based on her analysis of insurgent decision-making patterns under resource pressure. Thermal imaging detected systematic movement around the secondary stronghold that indicated preparation for another major relocation, but this time the patterns were different. Instead of organized convoy preparation, the activity suggested hasty evacuation under emergency conditions. Target is preparing for immediate movement, Major Chun reported, his voice carrying the controlled excitement of someone whose tactical phase was finally beginning. Movement patterns suggest they're abandoning defensive positions rather than conducting planned relocation. This looks like emergency evacuation rather than strategic repositioning. Maria consulted her analysis of regional geography and insurgent operational patterns to predict their most likely emergency destination. Based on resource requirements and current supply constraints, they have only one viable option for emergency relocation: the abandoned mining facility, approximately 60 kilometers to the southwest. It's the only location within their operational range that has independent power generation and water supplies. Captain Rodriguez confirmed the prediction with communications intelligence. Intercepted transmissions reference mountain facility and independent resources. They're coordinating with minimal personnel at what appears to be a previously established emergency position. The abandoned mining facility represented the ultimate validation of Maria's strategic approach. It was indeed capable of supporting insurgent operations without external supply lines, but it was also tactically indefensible and completely isolated from community support networks. By forcing the insurgents to relocate there, Maria had maneuvered them into a position where conventional military operations would be maximally effective. Dr. Mitchell analyzed the cultural and political implications of the insurgent movement toward the mining facility. Local authorities confirm that the facility has been abandoned for over 2 years due to environmental concerns and tribal objections to mining operations. There's no civilian population in the area, and tribal leaders have specifically requested that the site remain unoccupied. If insurgents move there, they'll be operating in direct opposition to local preferences. The political isolation was as important as the tactical vulnerability. By forcing the insurgents to operate from a location that local communities opposed, Maria had eliminated their ability to claim community support or use civilian presence as protection against military operations. They would be completely exposed to conventional assault while having no legitimate political justification for their presence. Major Chun began repositioning his tactical team for operations around the mining facility. This location is ideal for direct assault. Multiple approach routes, minimal defensive advantages, no civilian complications, and complete isolation from potential reinforcement. If they relocate there, we can execute a textbook rescue operation with maximum probability of success. Maria felt a surge of vindication as she watched her strategic predictions materializing exactly as calculated. The insurgents were being forced to abandon every tactical and strategic advantage they'd originally possessed, trading security for basic operational viability. Her systematic pressure had accomplished what conventional military force could never achieve, maneuvering the enemy into a position where American tactical superiority would be overwhelming. "Colonel Harrison," Maria reported, "the insurgents are moving toward their final position. Based on current movement patterns and resource requirements, they'll reach the mining facility within 6 hours. Once they're established there, Major Chun's team will have optimal conditions for rescue operations." Colonel Harrison's response reflected the satisfaction of someone whose risk-taking was being validated by successful outcomes. "Outstanding work, Ms. Santos. Major Chun, what's your assessment of tactical requirements for operations at the mining facility?" Major Chun consulted his tactical analysis of the target location. The facility offers multiple infiltration routes, with excellent concealment until final approach. Minimal defensive positions that can't be significantly improved without heavy equipment they don't possess. Most importantly, the layout provides clear lines of sight for identifying and securing the prisoners before engaging hostile personnel. The tactical advantages were overwhelming, but Maria understood that the operation's success would ultimately depend on precise timing and coordination. The insurgents were moving under emergency conditions, which meant they would be focused on basic survival rather than optimal defensive positioning. However, it also meant they might be more likely to make desperate decisions about the prisoners if they realized their situation was hopeless. Captain Rodriguez provided intelligence analysis that addressed the timing considerations. Communications intercepts suggest They're planning to use the mining facility as a temporary position, while negotiating for safe passage to a more secure location. They're not planning extended operations there, which means they're less likely to implement extreme security measures or make irreversible decisions about the prisoners. Dr. Mitchell added political analysis that supported immediate action once the insurgents reach the mining facility. Local authorities are prepared to provide post-operation support for securing the area and conducting any necessary cleanup. They're also willing to claim responsibility for the successful operation if political considerations require minimizing apparent American involvement. The political cover was important for maintaining regional relationships while demonstrating that unconventional military methods could achieve strategic objectives without creating diplomatic complications. Maria's approach had not only succeeded tactically, but had also reinforced positive relationships with local authorities and tribal leaders. At 2,134 hours, thermal imaging confirmed that the insurgent convoy had arrived at the mining facility and was beginning to establish basic defensive positions. The activity patterns showed personnel focused on securing essential resources and communications, rather than implementing comprehensive defensive measures. Most importantly, the prisoners appeared to be housed in a structure that was isolated from the main defensive positions, reducing the risk of casualties during rescue operations. Target has reached final position, Major Chun reported. Initial reconnaissance shows minimal defensive improvements and suboptimal positioning of personnel. Prisoners appear to be secured in location that allows for clean extraction with minimal risk of crossfire. Maria reviewed the complete operational picture one final time before recommending the transition from strategic pressure to tactical execution. Every element of her plan had developed exactly as predicted. The insurgents had been systematically maneuvered from a position of tactical strength to one of complete vulnerability, while American forces had gained every possible advantage for direct action. Colonel Harrison, Maria announced, strategic objectives have been achieved. The insurgents are now positioned for optimal rescue operations with minimal risk to American personnel or the prisoners. I recommend immediate authorization for Major Chun to execute tactical operations. Colonel Harrison's authorization was immediate and decisive. Major Chun, you have operational authority for immediate rescue operations. Ms. Santos, your strategic planning has created optimal conditions for success. Dr. Mitchell, ensure that local authorities are prepared for post-operation coordination. The transition from strategic planning to tactical execution represented the culmination of everything Maria had worked toward during her military career. Her unconventional approach had successfully created conditions where conventional military excellence could achieve decisive results with minimal risk and maximum probability of success. Major Chun's final preparation phase began immediately, with his special operations team moving toward assault positions around the mining facility. Tactical team deploying for final approach. Estimated time to target engagement, 45 minutes. All elements report ready for execution. Maria remained in the operations center, monitoring intelligence feeds and maintaining strategic oversight, while Major Chun assumed tactical command for the final phase. Her role was shifting from operational planning to strategic analysis, ensuring that the rescue operation maintained the advantages her systematic pressure had created. The next hour would determine whether her unconventional methods could achieve complete success, validating everything she believed about innovative approaches to military operations while bringing 3 American soldiers home safely. After 2 years of struggle and doubt, Maria was finally seeing her capabilities utilized at their highest level in service of a mission that truly mattered. At 2347 hours, Major Chun's voice crackled through the radio with 4 words that changed everything. All packages secure, extraction complete. Maria closed her eyes as relief flooded through her body. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Kim, Specialist Marcus Thompson, and Private First Class David Lee were alive and safe, rescued without a single casualty through methods that conventional military doctrine had never imagined possible. But it was what happened next that truly vindicated her approach. As Maria gathered her files to leave Fort Bragg, Colonel Harrison approached with a document that would reshape her entire future. "Miss Santos, the Joint Chiefs want to see you next week. They're creating a new Strategic Innovation Division, and they want you to lead it." 3 days later, Maria stood before a room full of generals, her simple tattoo visible on her wrist as she outlined how unconventional thinking could revolutionize military operations. No one questioned her authority now. No one dismissed her ideas as insubordination. "The number's 247 on my wrist," she explained to the senior leadership, "represent the soldiers I kept supplied during those critical weeks in Iraq. 247 lives, preserved through innovation rather than regulation." 6 months later, Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos commanded a team of military innovators who solved impossible problems through unconventional thinking. Her methods were now studied at war colleges. Her approach had saved dozens of lives, and her story had become proof that sometimes the best ideas come from the people others overlooked. The woman they once called just an observer had revolutionized how America fought its wars. What incredible story would you want to hear next? Drop a comment below and let us know. If this story of determination and vindication inspired you, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell, because every week we bring you real stories of ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things. Your support helps us share these powerful tales of courage and innovation with the world.